Hey guys, the finale to Survivor 44 is right around the corner, and it is now time to do my jury scenarios video, where I go through each of the possible final 3 scenarios and rank them based on how likely I think they're to happen, and forecast what I think would happen if those scenarios were to play out. Now, at the time of recording, there are 5 players left in the game, those being Carolyn, Carson, Heidi, Lauren, and Jam Jam. And I think just looking at these 5, I think the winner is clearly within the Tika 3. I feel like they're by far the most likely to win the game. And I think based on the edit, it's pretty clear that one of them will win the game. Now, that's not to say that Heidi and Lauren can't get certain votes. However, I think by far the favorites in each of these scenarios will probably be one of the Tika 3. And then moving over to the jury, where we currently have 6 people on the jury, those being Matt, Brandon, Kane, Franny, Danny, and Jamie, who was just voted out. And I think if we look at each of them, while there are certainly some of them that are a bit higher on Heidi and Lauren, where I think Jamie could be a vote for Lauren, I think Danny could possibly vote for Heidi in certain scenarios. I think each of them are looking at a particular Tika member as their most likely jury vote, given their relationship in the game, based on how they were presented on the show, and how I think they're going to view each of their games if they are to sit at the end. Now, in terms of which Tika member each jury member prefers, I think it definitely will vary, where I assume that Jan Jam will definitely have the most people leaning in his favor. I think Matt could be a vote for him, given that they survived together during the split tribal. I think Brandon will see Jam Jam as the best player, given what he literally said in that episode to Matt about how whoever survives his vote will probably be the best player at the end. And if we're looking at the potential jurors based on who's left in the game, I think Carolyn's closer to Jam Jam than she is to Carson, plus she probably thinks that Carson may be a bit too young to be awarded $1 million. I think Carson will probably see Jan Jam as the better player, and I think Heidi would also be a bit closer to voting Jan Jam over Carson as well. As for Carson, I think he could definitely get some votes as well. I think Jan Jam, if he were to be cut along the way, I think he would probably vote Carson over Carolyn, given that they were shown working more towards with each other than with Carolyn for a lot of the game. I think Lauren would be a vote for Carson, given that we learned from Jamie's exit interview that Lauren and Carson were very close, and Carson really built inroads with her. And I also think Danny and Kane could be votes for Carson as well, given that Carson seems more aligned with the way that they would play the game. I think they would see Carson as the more outwardly strategic player, although they certainly like Jan Jam as well. And I think that sort of leaves Carolyn in the worst spot to actually win the game of the Tikas, where, yes, while we have seen people talking about her being a big threat and how they respect her for wearing her emotions on her sleeve, I think if we're actually looking at the jury votes, it's hard for me to pinpoint which person would actually be willing to vote for her outside of Franny, who did actively talk in confessional about how she looks up to Carolyn and sees her as a role model. I think everyone else may be open to voting for Carolyn in certain scenarios. However, I think Jan Jim and Carson would have the upper edge in getting those votes. However, if this is similar to how I felt at the time of the 43 finale, there's definitely plenty of potential for Carolyn to change minds. I think the way that she could play this endgame could definitely dictate how the jury sees her moving forward. However, based on what we know right now, based on what we see on the show and in exit interviews, I don't really see many locked votes going towards Carolyn. So I think on the whole, I think this jury vote could go a number of different ways depending on who gets to the end and how they get to the end. But with all that said, there are 10 final 3 scenarios to talk about, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 10, the final 3 scenario I think is the least likely to happen is Carson versus Heidi versus Lauren. And the main reason I think this one's at the bottom is it's the one jury scenario that does not have either Carolyn or Jam Jam. And considering that I think the edit is clearly propping up one of those two to win the game, I think this leaves the scenario to be highly improbable. And plus, I think it includes 2 people that I think are the most likely to be cut before the end, those being Carson and Lauren. So I think in order for this scenario to happen, I think we would need to see Carson pull off this move of flipping against, say, Carolyn at Final 5 and then Jan Jam at Final 4 to secure him getting to the end. And while he did talk in confessional last episode about how it's not the right time to turn against Carolyn, I just don't see how this scenario plays out based on what we've seen up until this point. I think Carson is way more likely to be seen as that threat at the very end and be cut and fire. Now, if this scenario were to happen, I think Carson would have the upper hand. I think he would win this jury vote pretty handily, where I think he would get most of the jury votes. Now, I think Jamie probably votes for Lauren, as Jamie is obviously pretty close to Lauren and sees Lauren as her biggest threat. So I think Jamie would support Lauren because of that. I could see a world where Brandon votes for Lauren as well, given their relationship. But even then, I think Brandon would recognize Carson as a better player in that scenario. Now, I think Danny could also be a bit up in the air, as while he is closer to Carson, I could also see him voting for Heidi, especially in this endgame scenario where potentially Heidi is able to take out some of these big threats. But even then, I think Carson might get more of the credit for that. So while there's plenty of potential for Heidi and Lauren to get some votes, I think Carson would be the pretty clear favorite in all this. But considering I don't think Carson's getting to the end, and really Lauren either, I think I'd delete this scenario here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have another scenario that I find largely unlikely, but here we have Carolyn versus Carson versus Lauren. And this is a weird one, as this one obviously has 2 Tika members in it, and it even has Carolyn, who I said earlier is one of the more likely players to win based on her edit. However, it also has Carson there, and I don't really see a world where Carolyn and Carson go to the very end with each other, particularly over Jam Jam, unless it's a situation where Lauren wins final immunity and puts Carson and Jam Jam into fire and Carson wins in that scenario. Maybe there's a world where that happens. But really, I think based on the setup Carson got, I think Carson's probably going to try to cut Carolyn along the way, but obviously come up short there. And I think Carolyn is more likely to take Jam Jam to the very end compared to Carson, as she probably sees Carson as her biggest threat compared to Jam Jam. So I think because of that, this scenario is pretty unlikely to happen. Now, if it were to happen, I think Carson would once again have the upper edge, where I think he gets most of the votes there. Same sort of principle applies, where I think Jamie and Brandon could be a bit up in the air. Although even then, I could see a world where they could just vote for Carson, to where this would probably be like a 7-1 vote. However, I still think Franny probably votes Carolyn in this scenario. I feel like that's probably one of the more likely cases to happen based on Franny's edit on her way out. But really, I feel like Carson would be seen as the more strategic player, probably the player that gets more respect for getting their way through their game, especially in this fashion. But considering I don't think Carson is winning, I do have to leave it here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another scenario very similar to the one we just talked about, but here we have Carolyn versus Carson versus Heidi. And again, we're just swapping out Lauren for Heidi. And the reason I have this one above the one with Lauren is I think Heidi's more likely to get to the end based on her edit, as realistically, I think Lauren is in a lot of danger to be cut around Final 5. And literally with Heidi being given more content for her going into fire, I think this is a somewhat probable scenario. Now, I think in this scenario, we would have to see Heidi beat Jam Jam in fire, which I don't think is the most likely scenario in the world. I think Heidi's way more likely to go up against like Carson in fire, if I'm being honest. And similar to what I said earlier, I just don't see Jam Jam losing this battle if he were to try to take a shot at Carolyn. And really, I think Carson's pretty doomed in terms of getting to the end. However, if the scenario were to happen, I think Carson would once again win the game. Where I think the one question mark here is, where does Danny go? Does he vote Carson or Heidi in this scenario? Now, again, I think he leans Carson, though I could see a world where he votes for Heidi as well. But I think Jamie's vote for Carson in this scenario, and same thing with Franny voting for Carolyn. But every other vote, I would assume, would go to Carson, unless there's something that I'm missing that could lead to Carolyn being more competitive. But at the end of the day, I don't think Carson's getting to the end, which is why the scenario is here number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have what I'm sure a lot of people will describe as the dream scenario for this season. However, I just think it's not going to happen. But here we have Carolyn versus Carson versus Jam Jam. That's right, all 3 Tikas getting to the end together. And I know a lot of people think this is going to happen, but I just don't think it will. I think one of them will be cut along the way. And again, based on my previous videos, I think that person will be Carson, though who knows. But now I think what's going to happen is I think they're probably going to get through for the final 5 all right. But I think around the final 4 is when they're really going to start thinking about the very end, who they can win against. And I think we're also going to see like potentially Heidi screwing things up, either by winning final immunity and forcing them into fire, or maybe just outright beating whoever gets sent into fire along the way. And the fact that we even got content this past episode about Jam Jam wanting to flip on Carolyn is a pretty clear sign that they are thinking about getting to the end. And I don't think it's in their best interest for them to all get to the end together, obviously. And I think they recognize that. So I think they're more than likely going to cut each other along the way. However, in a strange world where they all get to the end together, I think it would lead to a very interesting jury vote. Now, straight up, I think Carolyn would lose this. I think she would maybe get Franny's vote. However, I think that's probably the only vote she ends up getting in this scenario. I think it really becomes a battle between Jam Jam and Carson, and I think it could be close, where I think Carson would get the votes of Kane, Danny, and Lauren, whereas I think Jam Jam could get the votes of Heidi, Jamie, Brandon, and Matt. And in that case, Jam Jam would win in a 4-3-1 vote. However, I think Franny might recognize that Carolyn doesn't have a shot and may try to throw her votes onto one of the others. Now, if I had to suspect, I think she would throw her vote onto Jam Jam, which would give Jam Jam a 5-3 win. However, in the world where she votes for Carson and forces a 4-4 tie, that would obviously lead to Carolyn having to break the tie, and I think she would vote for Jam Jam over Carson, leading to Jam Jam winning there. So I think at the end of the day, I think Jam Jam would win this scenario. However, I think Carson would definitely make things competitive, and in general, this will be an interesting jury vote. However, considering that I think the Tika 3 will not make it to the end together, I do have to leave it here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and I think these next two scenarios are pretty interesting. And while before this most recent episode, I wouldn't have said they were possible, I think there's now a possibility where they could happen. But at number 6, we do have Carson versus Lauren versus Jam Jam. And I think the revelation in the recent episode that Jam Jam thinks Carolyn is his big threat could cause a world where Carolyn becomes targeted here. Now, I don't think Carolyn goes at Final 5, but I think Final 4, like, if she's put into fire and, like, Jam Jam beats her, then I think that could make for an interesting conclusion to their storyline throughout the season, which in turn would lead to this scenario happening. And if it were to happen, I think it wouldn't be another competitive jury vote, where, admittedly, I think Jam Jam would have the advantage here, sort of similar to the last scenario, but again, I think Carson would make things competitive, where I think straight up, Carson would get the votes of Kane, Franny, and Danny, while I think Jam Jam would get most of the remaining votes. I think he gets Matt's vote, I think he gets Brandon's vote, I think he gets Carolyn and Heidi's votes, which makes it a 4-3 vote. And then the one swing vote potentially is Jamie, where Jamie did see Lauren as her biggest threat throughout a lot of the season, which makes me think that she might lean Lauren in this scenario. However, I know that of the Tikas, Jamie was the closest to Jam Jam, and in a world where she knows that Lauren isn't winning, I could see her throwing her vote onto Jam Jam, which would make it a 5-3 victory. However, even if she votes for Lauren, it would still be a 4-3-1 Jam Jam win. So I think Jam Jam would win this scenario handily, although Carson would once again make things competitive. So I think this scenario is now a bit more likely to happen than it was before, given the talk about Carolyn being this big threat, but I still think Jam Jam would win it out, and I think the fact that Carson is more likely to be taken out before the end leaves it here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have a very similar scenario, and we actually have the highest ranked scenario that has Carson in it, which I think goes to show what I think of Carson's chances, really in this endgame. But here we have Carson versus Heidi versus Jam Jam, again just swapping out Lauren for Heidi. And again, I think Heidi's potential to get to the end is higher than Lauren's, which is why I had this scenario above here. And I think this jury vote plays out pretty similarly. However, the key difference here is the fact that we're now swapping out Heidi for Lauren on the jury. And whereas Heidi, I would say, is a Jam Jam vote, Lauren is more of a Carson vote given their relationship within the game, which could open it up to a 4-4 tie. Now, yes, Danny could make things complicated by throwing his vote onto Heidi, which would make it a 4-3-1 Jam Jam win. However, if Danny votes for Carson and Lauren also votes for Carson, then we have a 4-4 tie, which would leave Heidi having to break it. And admittedly, Heidi votes for Jam Jam over Carson here, giving Jam Jam the win. But still, it's still the potential for a tie based on my forecast here. But again, I still don't think Carson's getting to the end. There's just so much foreshadowing that he's going to be cut by Final 4 fire that I did have to leave this scenario, and really all the scenarios involving Carson, below the ones that don't involve him. So because of that, I do have it here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and obviously these top 4 scenarios all involve Carson being cut along the way, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But at number 4, I did decide to go with Carolyn versus Heidi versus Lauren. And the main reason I went with this scenario over one we'll be talking about more in a moment is I think if I had to pick between Jam Jam and Carolyn getting to the end, I think Jam Jam is more locked in to get to the end compared to Carolyn. Whereas by me still thinking that they're both going to get to the end together, I think Carolyn has more setup for her to go out before the end compared to Jam Jam, which obviously leaves the scenario a bit lower. However, there's still a world where this could happen, where let's say at Final 5, they recognize that Carson's his big threat and they cut him there. And then at Final 4, like maybe Jam Jam loses in fire, or maybe it's the opposite, where they think that Jam Jam is better in fire, causing him to go out in 5th, and then they beat Carson in 4th, which would fulfill that foreshadowing, which would leave Carolyn in this interesting scenario with Heidi and Lauren. And I think looking at the jury votes, I think this is definitely Carolyn's best case scenario for winning the game, as she would definitely have 5 votes here. I think she gets the votes of Matt and Franny. I think she gets Kane's vote in this scenario. And I think he also gets both Carson and Jam Jam. That's 5 votes. That's already enough to win. However, I think the other 3 votes will probably go to the other people, where I think Danny probably votes for Heidi in this scenario, given that he didn't seem to have the best relationship with Carolyn while out there. And yes, while Carolyn did technically play the idol in the round where he went out, I think Danny is someone that may not fully respect Carolyn, may not give her the most credit for that move over anything else. And I think Lauren would probably get the vote of Jamie and Brandon, given their relationship from Raw 2, which would create a 5-2 to 1 vote. However, I still think Carolyn would have the upper edge here. I think she would win. And really, this is probably her best case scenario if she wants to actually win the game. But at the end of the day, I think the fact that Jam Jam is not in the scenario makes this a bit less likely to happen based on the edit, which is why I have it here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have a very similar scenario, but just subbing out one person. But here we have Heidi versus Lauren versus Jam Jam. And again, this largely comes down to me thinking that Jam Jam is edgically more likely to get to the end of the game than Carolyn, given the recent talk about Carolyn being a big threat. However, it's not the very top because I still think Carolyn and Jam Jam will get to the end together. And I think there is a world for this to happen where, let's say at 5, Carolyn is seen as the biggest threat, and they just take her out at that point. Like with the Tikas having the majority at this point, like they didn't want to do it before, but now that they do have the majority, they feel more comfortable cutting Caroline at that point. And then at 4, we see the thing that happens with Carson, with him losing fire, which leads to this scenario. And I think in this scenario, there's a world where Jan Jan could win unanimously here, where I think he would get almost every vote on lock, except for Danny, who I think could be up in the air between Heidi and Jam Jam, of course, and then Jamie, who might be a swing vote between Lauren and Jam Jam. However, even then, I could see a world where they could just recognize that Jam Jam played the better game and switch their votes there. So I think this has a lot of potential to be a near unanimous vote, if not a unanimous vote. And I think this is one of the more likely scenarios to happen, but still, I think it's not as likely as the top 2, which is why it is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and these top 2 scenarios both have Carolyn and Jam Jam in there. It's just a matter of ordering them. But number 2, we do have Carolyn versus Lauren versus Jam Jam. And again, I had the scenario this high because it has both Carolyn and Jam Jam in it. I feel like it is being set up for them getting to the end together, and at that point, one of them will win the game. And I think there's a world where it could happen, where at Final 5, let's say they assume Heidi's the bigger threat, which realistically is part of the reason why I don't have this one at number 1, as I think Lauren is less likely to get to the end compared to Heidi. And then Final 4, we see Carson still losing fire here, which would lead to this Final 3. And in this scenario, I think it's a bit tough because I said now over the past couple of weeks that I assume a Carolyn and Jam Jam jury vote would be close, as I feel like if it were going to be a slam dunk for one of them, that this post-merge would really dedicate more of its time to undermining the other person in the edit. However, we haven't exactly seen that per se, as both Carolyn and Jam Jam have had relatively balanced edits up to this point. And while that could be a sign that maybe Carolyn gets cut along the way, which would obviously cause one of these less lucky scenarios to take place, I think it could also lead to a case where maybe I'm underestimating Carolyn's jury chances on the whole. Sort of similar to what I did with Gabler last season, where even though I recognized the potential for him to win, I just couldn't see where the jury votes would come from. As if we are looking at this jury vote, I don't see Carolyn getting many votes here. The only locked in vote I have her for is from Franny. And then with Jamie being up in the air between Lauren and Jam Jam, I feel like that gives Carolyn very little room to actually be competitive in this jury vote, where I think Jam Jam would more than likely get the other jury votes and win pretty decisively here. Now, I guess you could argue that they are saving Carolyn's downfall more for the finale, where they really show her giving up her game for Jam Jam. I could see that happening to where it could cause Jam Jam to win at the end, or it could just be Carolyn having a journey edit. I mean, there's a lot of ways that this could go. However, if we are just looking at the individual jury votes, I feel like they are way more likely to go to Jam Jam than they are to Carolyn. I don't really see how they can look at their games and think that Jam Jam played a worse game than Carolyn, or that Carolyn's philosophy of being underestimated and putting her emotions first would lead to them voting for that over that of Jam Jam. So I feel like at the end of the day, I think Jam Jam will probably at the edge here. But considering the edit, I could very well see it being much more competitive than getting it credit for, which is why I do have it here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the final 3 scenario I think is the most likely to happen is Carolyn versus Heidi versus Jam Jam. And for me, this one isn't even close. I mean, Heidi literally says in the episode that her ideal final 3 is herself, Carolyn, and Jam Jam. And based on our edits, I feel like these 3 are the most likely to get to the end together, as I feel that Lauren's edit is more in line with that of a Final 5 boot, and I feel like there's so much setup to Carson losing in Fire, and with Heidi getting her own content in episode 1 about how she's underestimated while she's making Fire, I think the most likely case is that Lauren goes at 5, and then Heidi ends up in Fire Final 4 against Carson, to which Heidi wins, which would obviously lead us to getting this scenario. And I think if the scenario were to happen, I think it'd be very similar to the one we just talked about, where I think Heidi could maybe get Danny's vote, but I think all the other ones would probably be between Jam Jam and Carolyn. And as I said a moment ago, I think it's still leading to a decisive Jam Jam win. I mean, based on what we've seen on the show and based on what we've seen in exit interviews and based on how I think the season's going to play out, I think the jury on paper is going to favor Jam Jam over Carolyn. But again, similar to how I felt about Gabler this time last season, I could see a world where Carolyn makes it right at the end. She makes a big move, and then that somehow leads to the jury giving all this credit to Carolyn. And heck, maybe it's possible that they think the Danny move, like her playing the Idol Final 7, will be seen as this much bigger move than I'm giving it credit for here, where we could see this relatively close jury vote. However, we could also see Carolyn laying down her game for Jam Jam Final Tribal, or her thinking that her getting to the end is enough versus actually winning. I think there's a number of ways that this could go. I think it could either be a decisive Jam Jam vote, as I assume it's going to be based on these current jury votes, or I could see it leading to Carolyn surprising us at the end and us feeling like it's going to be a much more competitive jury vote at the end of the day. So I think there's a lot of ways that this could go. I admit that I don't have all the information. However, I think just looking at the edit, I think this one's by far the most likely to happen. And because of that, it is here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, I am planning to update the Power Rankings one more time before the finale, so stay tuned for that. On finale night, I plan to live stream, so you can come on board. We can talk about the finale as it's happening live, so stay tuned for that. And then after the season, I'm going to be doing my review and player ranking, so stay tuned for that as well. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which you can join by clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that's the video. See ya.